all of our members who are here tonight and online for your dedication to what we do here, because without you, we couldn't have these fun lectures and programs that we do here at Okefenokee. So we're going to get started, because tonight I get to teach, which is so different tonight. So I'm sure everyone in this room is already familiar with the Okefenokee Swamp. So tonight I am going to talk a little bit more about the ecology and kind of preach to the choir about why this place is so significant and why we think it's so important to us as Georgians as well as Americans, that this is a place for all of us to share and love. And then Alice Kais is going to come up and she's going to share about the work we have been doing over the last few years and what is to come with our work in the Okefenokee. It's an ongoing. So just to orientate all of us to where the Okefenokee is located, we are approximately somewhere, that little peninsula right there. So about 60 miles west is the Okefenokee Swamp. It does go into and over the border into Florida, but when a lot of people refer to it, we only refer to the refuge part, or what the part that is part of protected lands, and that is that green section that's highlighted on the map. And it also spans multiple counties in Georgia, where Clinch and Charleston, and then it also goes into Baker County and Florida. So pretty significant. It's about 700 square miles, so pretty large. I hate this fact, but it's about roughly half the size of Rhode Island. But as Georgians, how many Rhode Island? So a little closer up of it, it is a mixture of different habitats, and we'll get into that later. There are multiple entrances into the swamp, and we'll talk all about these amazing different locations. But we have to go back in time in order to get to where we are today. So pre-1890s, this was an area used by the indigenous peoples. It was a place for resources. It was also a place to hide because nobody wanted to follow you into a swamp. So Native Americans hid in there. Escaped slaves have been known to were told were hidden there. Other people were, because people thought this wet, boggy area was not really useful for much, because there were a lot of alligators, people thought of bugs, and of course snakes. There was not a lot of value back in the late 1800s to what was at Okefenokee. But so at that time, the Swanee Canal Company came in, because this is the time where lumber became super cash crop all over the Georgia coast. So they saw the Okefenokee as a couple things, to get timber, and also an idea to drain all this water out of here and use it for farmland. So the Swanee Canal Company came in with the idea of draining the Okefenokee Swamp by digging 200 miles of canals in order to connect to the Swanee so it would drain out. Good for us today is that the story is that the man who bought it didn't do his homework and didn't really do a geological survey of where it was. He also used convicts to dig it, and he used coal miners to try to blow his way through it. And unfortunately, he failed for all of us and only got 20 miles of that proposed done. And ended up going bankrupt in the process. That's when the Herbert Lumber Company came in. They bought it up, and they decided they were going to repeat the mistakes of the Swanee Canal Company, and they decided to build railroad tracks into the swamp in order to get all that lumber out. And actually, they built floating railroad tracks in there. And there are places that still today you can actually see, when the water's lower, you can actually see those rails out in there. And I've heard there's train cars, so I have not personally seen them. So they built these trails into there, and they were able to remove most of the cypress and longleaf pine out of this region. At the same time, this is when Folkston, Georgia became one of the premier cities, because so many people came in this short little time. There was a booming city of and creating all these logging camps for all of these people. So it is said that Folkestone, how many of you have driven Folkestone before? It's a pretty, like, I know there's a couple stoplights, but not that many. It has one of the first movie theaters in Georgia because of how prosperous it was during this very short boom time. It does not have a movie theater today. So that is how it did. So pretty much the Okefenokee as we know it today was pretty devastated from that. So after they came in, there then became the talk about building, we're now in the Great Depression, time to build a canal that cut off Florida. So from the Atlantic to the Gulf. It was the Atlantic Gulf Canal. So this is a project during the Great Depression. We used a lot of labor, it would create some funds, and so it would cut off so we could get goods and services from the Gulf to the Atlantic much faster. Obviously, it would have devastated, and the Okefenokee would no longer be there. So there was a bunch of naturalists that were starting to get together to advocate. So people have been advocating for the Okefenokee before we even have it as a refuge. They were coming in, starting to advocate. One of those people was Francis Harper. Francis Harper was a naturalist. He also liked to study different cultures. He was known for studying the Appalachian culture and especially the different languages up there. So he actually came to the Okefenokee to actually study hollering, which was the way the swampers, the people who lived around the swamp, communicated. And they would actually, it's similar to a yodel. And that would actually, because of the shallow water and the humid air, those sounds would actually bounce really far, similarly to how in Switzerland it would bounce off the Alps. So they did this similar sort of hollering. So he came down to study it. So he studied that, but he also, with this team of other naturalists he knew, studied and learned how important and how biologically diverse this region was and how many different plants and animals still lived in this area. Well, it just happened that Francis Harper's wife, Jean, was a tutor to the president's children. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a lot of you familiar, he actually came to Georgia to use the hot springs, and while he was there, Jean Harper was one of the tutors that worked with his children. So it took many years and many letters, but the story is that her letters are actually what eventually got FDR to realize the importance of the Okefenokee and stopped what would have been the Atlantic Gulf Canal. And I'm going to see if this works.
We want to hear you holler.
Now housed at the Library of Congress, preserve the South Georgia hollering tradition at its peak of head and chest tones, Harper recording on the cattle at the end of the day.
So just a tad bit, because I couldn't, to hear it, if you were familiar with Dolan, there's a little bit of it. And so they would do calls that said to bring water, they would do it for time for food to come over. They also communicate to other neighbors that way. They could say, hey, come over, we're having extra food. There was a warning call that they would also sound, which I've heard before, which actually sounds kind of like an ambulance or like fire truck. So they had all these different ways of communicating. So culture also helped save the Okefenokee. Okay, so refuge was established in 1937 by an executive order by President Roosevelt, and that was just one of the statements he used in that executive order when he decided the importance of this place to protect. Later on, a large section, so you have a refuge, and refuges are designed to obviously maintain the ecology for plants and animals. So a little bit different than a national park, which makes paths and trails and roadways and parking much more easily for visitors. Refuges are not like that. They're not going to build roads and paths and parking lots to make it as easier. And then because of this significant over the years, in 1974, they added a wilderness area designation on top of that. So a protected area just got a whole much more protection on top of it. So that makes it even harder to do any changes or modifications or clear cuttings or anything to the swamp, because in the 70s, they realized even more how important this area was. So so this is the current size of the Okefenokee Swamp. And now we're going to get into those, now that we're up to modern times, where people go to visit. So the main refuge entrance is in Folkestone. So this is the closest entrance to Brunswick. And this is obviously the refuge entrance. There's also an outfitter there called Okefenokee Adventures. And they are allowed to bring in these flat bottom boats with a very small engine. And now I can't remember how many power, but a very... 10. And so they're allowed to go into the prairies in certain areas and take tours. They do, those of you who are going canoeing with me on Saturday, they will be our guides. There's also a wildlife drive that was already there, and a homestead. So the last family, the Chester family that lived in the Okefenokee, their homestead is there and is there for living histories. And then my favorite thing is that they have this boardwalk that goes from the upland areas out into the swamp to a large fire. This is actually taken from the top of the viewing tower or fire tower to see it. On the north side is Waycross entrance, and Waycross entrance is currently privately owned entrance in the swamp, and Okefenokee Swamp Park is there. And they have a visitor center. They have some great plans to build a new education center there with the DNR. But there you can also take shore boat tours out to the swamp. They still have a train tour, and they have some animal exhibits out there. But they have a new master plan, so Swamp Park entrance is definitely changing over the next couple of years. Kids that grew up here, this is where they used to go on field trips. Because they had animal shows and animal feedings, which have changed. And then the least visited of these three, however, definitely worth the effort to get there. On the far side in Fargo, Georgia, is the state park, C. Foster's. They have camping there, and cabins and platforms, and a visitor center, and they also rent out kayaks and do boat tours out there. But because of their remoteness, they are actually a dark sky designated state park. And so incredible views of the Milky Way, because with so few light pollution. So the unique thing is we're going to move on and talk about is that the habitats change depending on where you are. This is a huge section of area, so it doesn't look the same in every location. So each of these entrances of the park, you're seeing a very different Okefenokee. If it's more dominated by trees or by prairies. So they're all very worthwhile visits. And, oh, that's blurry. How unfortunate. But just again, Okefenokee, not just even C. Foster, but all of it if you are lucky enough to camp or paddle across it because of its remoteness. Beautiful dark sky designations, and there's so few of those, especially here on the East Coast. And it did get the whole park did also get that recognition in 2016. So now I'm going to burst a little bubble. We call Okefenokee a swamp. By definition, it's not a swamp. It's a bog. But it doesn't ring. Okefenokee bog doesn't ring the same way. It's because Okefenokee is a very shallow peat bog. Peat is organic material that as it falls into this area and it builds up because there's very little oxygen, so it can't decompose. So you get these very thick layers of peat that form on the bottom, and it's just, and so this is an area that was peat on the bottom, but actually rose to the top, or what we call a blow up. And so if you would walk on this, it's very unsteady. So I've heard this is not as correct, but this is what you hear. Okefenokee is an indigenous word that means land of the trembling earth. I've heard that translation is not as easy as that, but because when you would walk across these very shallow areas, you would be unstable. So trembling earth is where that term came from. So the average depth of water in the Okefenokee is between 6 and 18 inches, give or take. It is rain dependent. There is only a very small percentage of a spring or any water that flows in. So it's highly, and this is really important for what Alice will talk about later, that it's dependent on rainfall. About 60 inches of rain a year, give or take, is how much falls into the Okefenokee. A swamp would have water flowing into it. And since this is rain dependent, it's a bog. So that's the difference of those terminologies. Also, so besides that, we already talked about that, so you can already see the difference. This is actually one of the canals, this is one of the canoe paths out there. So you can see that this area is not trees, and you get these boggy and these other plants that can grow because it's so shallow of that water. This water is also, because of all that peat in there, it's a very low pH. So the acidity is very high within the Okefenokee, which also is why it does not decompose very quickly. But it also doesn't allow the formations of mosquito eggs to hatch. So this pH is too low. It's considered a black water swamp, and you've heard about our black water rivers around here. Because of that pH in this water, it also makes it sweet. Have you heard of sweet water or sweet rivers? Because that pH, so early explorers would come into our rivers, and then even the indigenous Native Americans, they would come in and they could get this water because it would stay fresher longer because the pH would kill the bacteria and other things growing in that water. That's where that comes. And black water is when all of these leaves and all of that peat is in there, it releases tannic acids, or like making a hot cup of tea. It releases those acids and stains the water. So it's not dirty, it just has all those tannic acids within it. So on the east side, or the Folkston side, you are going to be more dominated by these prairies. So these are flooded grasslands. So when you think of a prairie out west, they're just flooded wetland grass areas. And you will have all these little blow-ups of peat with all the seeds in them. Once they're exposed to air, they'll start growing. In the spring, it's extra spectacular when the blue flag iris is blooming, but you have lots of different plants that will be out there in these very shallow waters. But this is only about 20% of the habitat in the Okefenokee. You also have mixed cypress forests, so you have your pond and your bald cypress, which is your main trees, your hardwoods that are out there. Besides sweet gums and tupelos and other bays and laurels that you can find out there as well. And that's about a quarter too. So this is from the west side. So the opposite side, you get more of these larger stands of cypress trees, a little bit more out open instead of some thicker brush that you'll see on the east side. And a majority, because it's just a giant bowl of water, it does affect it a lot by evaporation. So the water's coming in from rain and also evaporating back up into the sky. And then also areas where fire has come through, because fire is synonymous with there, you'll get areas that are a little bit deeper. So there are lakes out there, so there are about 60 lakes, and that means there's also about 70 islands, give or take, out there as well, where the water's a little bit deeper, and then where the land is actually solid land that's not just floating peat, which trees have established themselves. And then, most importantly too, is that it's the headwaters for two major rivers. Here in Georgia, we have the St. Mary's, which has a lot less flow out of it, and it is our border. It allows us to have this little funny Naugahyde of Georgia, and is our border from Okefenokee this way with Florida, which goes up to the Atlantic, and then the larger Swanee, which actually flows out until the Gulf of Mexico. And about 80% of the water flows out of the Swanee. Because of all these unique habitats, we have over 600 species of plant that have been found in the Okefenokee. I picked some of the more spectacular ones to look at. There are multiple types of carnivorous plants out there because they're living in a nutrient-poor environment. They're not in soil, they're in water, that they have adapted to getting a lot of their nutrients from insects. So our pitcher plants, this is a flower of a pitcher plant, but you can see the curve, have developed a way to attract insects into that tube, and then they get confused by these little white dots that look like windows, so they fly, just like in your house, fly into the windows and don't see the dark outer part. And then there's downward facing hairs. It's like a fun house of hell. And they fall down and then they get absorbed. There's also a plant called a sundew out there, which kind of looks like a sea star. Has all these little legs on it, which again sweet selling sap, and it can wrap up its little food. And then my favorite is the bladderwort, which eats tiny microscopic things. It just floats in the water and has little air pockets, a little trigger, and when a plankton goes to it, sucks it in. And they're just all in there, all of that. Another really unique plant found out there is the goldenrod when it's blooming, or the neverwet the rest of the year. Besides being edible when it's in its blooming stage, those leaves, when you dip them in water and you pull them out, the water just trickles right off of it, hence the term neverwet, which is a cool coating that scientists have looked at to see how the water just repels right off of those plants. With plants, you also then get a ton of different types of wildlife that are also found out there. 40 different mammals, 50 reptiles, amphibians, birds, and obviously fish out there. Some of the really unique species that are out there, obviously alligators are probably the most well-known species that's out there, but this is a Florida soft-shell turtle, a barn owl, which is, when you go out there during the daytime, is an owl you will often see in the daytime, so pretty neat. And then people don't think about it, there are a lot of river otters out there, and this is the time of year to see them because it's cold, and so the alligators are inactive. They can't eat because they're ectoderms, so those otters are a lot more active this time of year because the predators are not as likely. So
And deposits, for the most part. They used to be, you can think of it as, you know, again, old sand dunes. Some of them were old islands at some point, and so you have these, you know, really heavy mineral sand deposits, which make that area very attractive to mining companies. Those heavy mineral sand deposits can be processed. You filter out all the sand, you pull out the minerals, you then process the sand to make important compounds like titanium dioxide. And that's the heavy mineral, or the mineral of choice in this area. Historically, there actually is mining going on right now in some of these heavy mineral sand deposits. In Brantley County, do we have a pointer on here? I don't want to push anything.
Pointed at the laptop.
There we go, look at that. Okay.
It was way over there.
Way over here.
Oh, you're trying to use the, oh, it doesn't work on a computer.
Okay.
I mean a computer screen.
Okay. So in this area here, you can see this is another one of the heavy mineral deposit areas in the lighter tan. There is a mine that Chemours operates in Offerman, Georgia, and it's active and they're processing zirconium and titanium for use. There's different uses of titanium dioxide. You can use it for military purposes, for cell phones. That's really high quality titanium dioxide. The titanium that's processed from these heavy mineral sand deposits is lower quality, so it's more used for like tooth whitening and Oreo, the filling in Oreos and stuff like that. Yeah. So again, there is mining going on in southeast Georgia around these heavy mineral sand deposits right now. But the most controversial mine was proposed by DuPont back in the late 1990s. Does anybody remember hearing about the DuPont? Yes. The DuPont era mine was proposed in this area along Trail Ridge, literally right next to the Okefenokee Refuge. The outcry from the American public was so great that DuPont basically, after years of trying to get the mining approved, basically abandoned their mining rights, turned the property over to the Conservation Fund, and now it's protected land. But again, you can see the difference between these the heavy mineral sand deposits and the location of where these mines are being proposed is the most important thing for us to keep in mind, because there's currently a proposal that I'm sure you've all heard about. Twin Pines Minerals out of Alabama has proposed, actually came in 2018. We sat down with one of their representatives. He came to our office when we were over on Newcastle Street and said, hey, we've got this mine that we want to provide. It's going to be great. You know, we're going to pull all this stuff up and put it right back the way. So we have 100 miles has been following this from the very beginning of Twin Pines' proposal. And we have had some concerns, to say it politely. But generally what Twin Pines is proposing is they own right now 8,000 acres of property along the southeastern section of southeastern corner of the refuge along Trail Ridge. So it's not in the refuge, make sure everybody understands that, but it's along Trail Ridge, that hydrogeologic dam that keeps Okefenokee whole. And one of the most important things to keep in mind is that it affects the St. Mary's River Basin headwaters. And so, as Stephanie mentioned, 20% of the Okefenokee Swamp drains to the St. Mary's River and empties out into the Atlantic Ocean. The other 80% of Okefenokee drains through the Suwannee and empties out into the Gulf of Mexico. So there's like this mini little continental divide within the Okefenokee Swamp, which is pretty fascinating. But we're going to come back to the issue of the quadrant. But so Twin Pines owns 8,000 acres. There was a lot of controversy around their first proposal that went to the federal government for the first step of permission to mine. When the Clean Water Act was changed, the federal government was removed from any jurisdiction because there were determined to be no jurisdictional wetlands in Twin Pines' property. Of the 8,000 acres, no jurisdictional wetlands. So they reduced their footprint and have proposed now a 600-acre demonstration mine to prove that their mining operations will not affect the Okefenokee Swamp. However, they've submitted all their paperwork to the Georgia Environmental Protection Division because now the federal agencies are no longer engaged. So the responsibility now lies with the state regulatory agency, the EPD, Environmental Protection Division. Many of y'all submitted comments to the EPD in the last round. We are still waiting for EPD's decision on whether they are going to permit Twin Pines Minerals to proceed. We don't know if they will proceed or not. So we're still waiting to figure out what the regulatory agency is going to do. But I did want to just kind of tell you a little bit about what they're proposing. So over the course of about 6 years, they would dig a pit that's 50 feet deep, 100 feet wide, and 500 feet long. Each year they would go back and forth with their machinery to process the sand, the heavy mineral sands, pull out all the minerals, send those away, and then put all the overdraft back where it came from. They would save the topsoil, so then they could put the topsoil back in place once they processed all the sands, mixed them all up, and put them back. But over the course of 6 years, they would do those 600 or so acres. Now the problem with that is that if you have a geologic formation that is hundreds of thousands of years old, it's made up of clays and sands and hardpan and all kinds of really interesting, very important formations that kind of create that dam. But if you dig it all up, you mix it all together, and then you put it back, there's no certainty that it will function in the same way that it has for hundreds of thousands of years. And so there's a big concern about the functionality of Trail Ridge, especially in that southeastern quadrant, should they proceed. Another concern is around water. So Twin Pines will have to pull about 1.5 million gallons of water a day from the Floridan aquifer, which is about 600 feet deep. I mean, it's a very deep water well to operate their mine. Now that will likely not affect the swamp itself, because again, it's a bowl, it's kind of on the surface. But what will affect the swamp is what Twin Pines is proposing to do, is to basically evaporate out 1.3 million gallons of water a day from the water that seeps into the pit, that 50-foot, 100 wide, 500 long pit, to evaporate out 1.3 million gallons of water a day of superficial groundwater. So that would be a consumptive loss to the entire ecosystem. Now, in a wet season, that's not a big deal at all, because the swamp is really connected all around. You know, water flows, ecosystems are connected through that water. But when it's dry, during drought, that's when the big problem comes, because the swamp itself compartmentalizes as the water drops, and you have very distinct regions. And that drainage area, that 20% drainage area that goes to the St. Mary's River, is the area that would be affected by reducing water flow to the swamp from Twin Pines' evaporative loss by 13% of the water naturally go into the swamp would be evaporatively lost. And so according to Dr. Brett Jackson at UGA, that would triple the severity of the drought conditions, likely significantly increasing the frequency of the drought and the impact of the drought, which would then lead to more wildfires. How many of y'all lived here during either 2007, 2011, or 2017 wildfires down in the Okefenokee? We got all that smoke here.
Oh, yeah.
It was significant. My family moved here in 2009, and so we got the impact of the 11 fires. But basically, when you have those massive wildfires, they start in the swamp. It's part, it's part of the natural system. Wildfires are part of the system. But when there's a drought condition, the wildfires are likely to occur more often and more severely. In 2007, in fact, the wildfire that started in the swamp then spread beyond the swamp boundary and basically eliminated about $65 million of commercial timber industry for the surrounding private property owners. And the federal government, I think during that time, had to spend $100 million in containing the fire in some way. But once it gets into the peak, it's over. Like, it's going to be burning forever. And so it's really dangerous to have, these a man-made drought on top of a natural drought, influencing the impact. So these are some of the three major concerns for the actual process of mining along Trail Ridge next to the Okefenokee Swamp. And so all of this has generated so much attention. There's been a group called the Okefenokee Protection Alliance at 100 miles helped form along with the Southern Environmental Law Center and a bunch of others. National, state, local groups are very engaged. The Georgia Water Coalition is a coalition of groups that deal with the legislature every year. It's a high priority for legislative issues. And so we have, again, a lot of support from our local folks. And those of you who are on our email list know that last legislative session that ended in April of this year was one of the most confusing and convoluted sessions, especially around the Okefenokee, because we had legislation that was proposed that would prohibit EPD from issuing permits to companies that want to mine just outside of the Okefenokee Refuge. It had more support than any other legislation that I've ever worked on. I've been here for 20 plus years, and I've never seen the level of support for House Bill 71, the Okefenokee Protection Act. But it didn't pass because the committee chair of the Natural Resources Committee failed to give it a vote. She had a hearing last year, but would not give it a vote this year. And so it was just stuck in committee, so death by committee. While 71 languished in committee, there were some other efforts to do something for the Okefenokee, and so there was some moratoria that were proposed. There was House Bill 1338 and Senate Bill 132 that were introduced during the legislative session. We saw these as, we call them meaningless moratoria, because they would basically prohibit dragline mining throughout the state. But then there were so many little loopholes that were built into the legislative language, into the bills. 1338 would have required any judge ruling on an appeal to, say EPD decides to deny a mining company their permit. They can appeal that to a judge, and the judge would have 120 days to make a decision. If that judge didn't make a decision in 120 days, then the mining company would automatically get their permit. So that was the kind of language that was built into these moratoria language, where it sounded great, oh, we're doing whatever we can, but it was really designed to benefit the mining companies themselves. So really problematic. And so quite a few of our fellow organizations supported Senate Bill 132 because it did not have a lot of that dangerous language, but the way we read it, it would have been an open door for Twin Pines to come in after they got their first 600-acre permit to mine. They could have come in and just automatically gone ahead and mined the 8,000 acres that they have. So there was this, again, there's this slippery language in legislation, and so we are gearing up for the 2025 legislative session because this is the year. January is the year. We're really hopeful because we've gotten a lot of positive insight from, I don't know if y'all recall, Speaker of the House John Burns said that the Okefenokee was going to be a high priority for the legislature. We're trying to get some more intel about what that means, and we're building a strategy around really making the Okefenokee a high priority. My guess is it's unlikely that we will have a flat-out ban like House Bill 71 did, just because of the difficulty of getting it through committee, but only time will tell. So now, again, gearing up for the legislative session, we really need y'all to be calling Speaker Burns, calling him up, sending him messages, asking him to kind of do what he said he was going to do and protect the Okefenokee, and then call Governor Kemp as well. There's really nothing we can do with the regulators right now with EPD. My guess is that if EPD denies the permit, Twin Pines will sue. If EPD grants the permit, then other people will sue. And so there's going to be that's going to be caught up in litigation for a little while. But for now, we can really expect and really hold our state legislators to their commitment to protect this national and state treasure. Every year we go up, and this is one of my favorite experiences this past year was a local day at the Okefenokee, where we went up and we had a press event where we brought in people from Waycross, from Jessup, and from Folkestone, and we kind of put them on the steps of the Capitol, and they told their story, and it was amazing. We had a lot of support, and because when the legislators get there in Atlanta, it's like they forget about their constituents. It's like they just function about who's going to be voting for their bill and who do they need to contact. They totally need to be reconnected by their constituents. And so if anybody is interested in going up to Atlanta, or you're in Atlanta already and you want to join us at the Capitol, please let us know. We would love to have you. There's some official days, like Capitol Conservation Day that the Georgia Water Coalition organizes, and then there's Okefenokee Day that the Chamber of Commerce from Folkestone will organize. So we'll be advertising those and getting word out about those as well. And then also just do exactly what Stephanie is inviting y'all to do on Saturday. Go experience the swamp. Invite your friends to join you. We have some signs that you can put out. And we have stickers. We got all kinds of stuff. Take some stickers home. Talking about this and inviting people to experience it is one of the most amazing ways of really celebrating the Okefenokee. My first experience in the Okefenokee was we did some longleaf pine plantings when I was just fresh out of college. And we got eaten by mosquitoes, but we were camping in the refuge itself. And so, with the sound of the owls, and we were there at a time when the sandhill cranes were calling. Oh my goodness, it's just magical. We didn't see the dark sky. I think it was too cloudy and overcast for us to see dark sky during the 4 or 5 days we were there. But it's truly amazing. And then lastly, the most pressing thing that we've got going on right now is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed to expand the acquisition boundary for the refuge itself. It's kind of confusing. If you look at this little map right here, you can see the black line. The green is the actual footprint of the refuge, the 400,000 acres or so. Then the black line is the outline of the current acquisition boundary. And that means that if one of these properties opens up within that boundary between the green and the black, Fish and Wildlife Service can go to those property owners and say, hey, we think we need to help you manage your property so that we can protect our refuge investment. And so they have the ability to then go out and work with the landowners for conservation easements or reducing the potential of wildfire impacts. And so they have proposed to do a minor expansion to that acquisition boundary. And these pink areas here are the areas where they would expand their acquisition boundary. And you can see it includes the area for Twin Pines that Twin Pines Mineral owns. This would give the federal government the opportunity to negotiate with Twin Pines, should they choose, about maybe establishing a conservation easement or purchasing it through fee simple or something like that. But right now they don't have that option. But with this boundary expansion, they will. They've extended the comment period for about until December the 13th, so you can submit comment periods to a wonderful tool that Katie helped create. And then there's also a public meeting, a virtual public meeting on December the 9th, if you're interested in learning more from the Fish and Wildlife Service directly about that. And we have a QR code that you can scan to make it easy for you to submit your comments if you like. So that is happening right now. Public comment period is wide open. Again, just all of this stuff is a lot that's happening. It's multifaceted, especially when it comes to Okefenokee. When it comes, we do trips, we go to Atlanta, there's the state legislature, we're helping support the federal government, but we're also really working hard to support the local people who, like Reverend Antoine Nixon, who are being absolute champions, and Josh Howard, who's the president of the Friends of the Okefenokee Refuge. Like, there's some amazing champions at the local level. And so if y'all are interested, just make sure that you sign up through our, to continue to receive all of our newsletters, and we really have appreciated your support for the longest time, because Okefenokee is near and dear to 100 miles, as much as it is near and dear to y'all who visited. But Sarah's gonna go soon, I know, and experience it for herself. But I think that with that, Stephanie, you can come back up and we can field any questions that y'all might have, but I think we might have some, okay.
Well, thank you so much for joining us online, and we hope to see you in another program soon.